Hi guys, DragonicEmpire here, and here with a Granblue Break Ride deck. So it took me a while to get around to this because I needed to do a little bit of testing for it. The Kikaitis Cross Ride deck seemed to just fall together on its own somehow. It was the easiest deck I've ever built. But yeah, this guy took a little bit more testing, and mainly because I didn't realise how amazing the Break Ride actually was, which is something I tend to do with Break Rides. I don't know why I do that. Anyway, so I'm going to start with the grade freeze first. Of course, play 4 of this great card. And if you're not too familiar with Nightmist, its effect is, when break-ridden, you get to call any 2 rear guards back, so you get to revive 2 cards for free. They gain 5k, but at the end of the turn are retired. So there are quite a few choices for this deck. I've even thrown a few tech choices in there just for fun, because I want to keep the deck as fairly technical as possible, relating to the whole gambit of Granblue in general, and kind of the reason why it's fun to play it. But yeah, these units he calls back can either generally be called just to add extra pressure, force a lot of guard at your opponent mid-game, this is a mid-game deck, it does that quite well. Or you can generally gain advantage off them, swap them for other units, and then they don't die at the end of the turn. Or you can use the effect of Kikaitis Reverse, and I've knocked the tripod, that's fun. So yeah, you can use Kikaitis Reverse, lock the newly called Break Right ridden unit that's been called to, say, this rear guard, lock it, mill 3 cards, and then choose another rear guard. That comes back but doesn't die at the end of the turn and gains 3k. So basically there are a lot of ways to capitalise off Nightmist, and I wouldn't always recommend going the power build in terms of letting a unit stick around, die at the end of the turn, but force a bit of extra guard unless you absolutely really need to. Or it just makes sense to do it at the time. But normally keeping one unit can make sense if it's a... I'll go into some of the choices later as to why it might be smart to keep some of them around. But yeah, mainly the deck actually puts out a fair bit more pressure than the original Granblue, which is absolutely great. So I'm going to move on to the grade 2s. Some of the choices might seem a bit weird, but I'll go through them as I do. I'll start with 4 of the 10k Commodore Blueblood. Generally, pretty decent defensive ride, and I'm playing a few 6ks in the deck, so once everything's settled, once you've called everything back, and you can't really afford to use Kaitisar's effects because this thing, it's really not smart to spam this guy. It's a pretty decent card. It's almost a free revival effect, but you're essentially taking a whole turn away from yourself. Milling 3 cards is a draw and a drive check, and when it comes to late game, and you want to finish them off, and if you spam this at the point where you've got 3 cards left in deck, it's not fun times. So don't want to be doing that. Anyway, Commodore Blueblood exists for the purpose of having a nice defensive ride. Can't get rushed, you can play the game out as long as you need to play it out, so you can play at your own pace. And the fact that you can call him to rearguard, and when you've got your 6ks, making 16k columns, once, I suppose, the dust settles, or the best way to describe it. But yeah, it's a pretty decent card, but overlooked. Playing Ruin Shade as an alternative, wouldn't recommend it, because yeah, I get it's 11k base, can help fix columns, applies a little bit of pressure just on its own, and can kind of work with stands, wouldn't recommend it in this build however. But Ruin Shade, milling those extra 2 cards, whilst giving you the setup, there are other ways to do it, and I really wouldn't recommend taking that much time away from yourself. Anyway, moving on to another major grade 2 choice, one of the cards that you probably want to get in the drop fairly early, because when you revive this guy, he becomes a 12k attacker essentially, gains 3k whenever he's revived. With Kikaitis' skill, Kikaitis adds 3k, plus this, that becomes 15k on its own. With a Samurai Spirit or a Banshee behind it, that's 21, 22. Or either of those, and when revived with Nightmist, gains an extra 8k, so it becomes 17 on its own. So this can be one of those cards that you want to apply a bit of pressure with, but maybe just let die, especially if you're planning to break ride again, which can be quite fun, because the advantage you get just from break riding is really, really nice. So sometimes maybe you want to clear up a few spots for yourself so that you can just do it next turn. And of course my tech choices, because I love tech choices in Granblue, you always need to have them. Captain Nightmist. I know this may seem like a weird card, but being able to swap things just to keep your advantage going. So even if you don't necessarily make very good columns with it, he can be used as lock fodder later on. Or generally just call him back if you don't want something to die and you just happen to mill him. It's kind of like playing an extra copy of Samurai Spirit in that regard. But it's a grade 2 and you get extra guard off it of course, which is pretty important too. And Deadly Spirit. There's actually a fair bit of soul spare in this deck too. And I'm only playing 1 copy of this card. You probably could get away with playing 2, I wouldn't use 2 in one turn of course. But yeah, after you've used some of your draw effects, if you spam your draw engine like a lot, like Granblue doesn't really tend to die these days unless it tends to deck out, or at least this deck doesn't anyway. I've never really ever run out of guard. It's normally getting to the point where you kind of run out of cards before you can kill them. That's like your only loss condition essentially. So this guy, with a fair bit of spare soul, if you want to be careful about using it, you can, yeah, do the same thing as Nightmist and save some of your units from dying, basically. Get free units for free, which is always good to have. And onto the Grade 1 choices. This guy is almost integral to this deck. Neither of the Grade 3s now have Counterblast costs, which is pretty huge. Counterblast being something that was really scarce in Granblue. More so the reason to play Pietro. I mean, I never really found space for it myself, but it's a good card, a good reason to play it. And Samurai Spirit's just being able to swap things around, fixing your field, and you want to play 4 so you can get it in the drop early, so that when you break ride you've got the option to swap things around really, and keep your units instead of losing 2 units at the end of the turn. So yeah, getting 2 free units can really work, and the units the best combined with this are of course the, I want to say New Cutlass, probably not the New Cutlass. It's a much cheaper cost however. See Strolling Banshee. When this card is revived from the drop zone, you can Soul Blast 1 to draw 1. Which, if you get 2 of these revived off of the break ride, can be pretty nice. You call them both back, Soul Blast 2, draw, for each one. So effectively, you can afford to let these die as 11k boosters, which isn't the end of the world because they kind of make up for themselves in that sense. But it's often smarter to get yourself field consistency, so you can swap them for these guys. And basically you draw 2 cards off the Banshees, and yeah, you get to keep your units essentially, so 4 cards off the break ride, which is very nice. And of course, mentioned earlier, the reason to have Commodore Blueblood is because generally, unless you can swap these out, they're going to be sitting around here normally taking up a bit of space. So it just means you can keep your pressure going essentially. Oh, I'll scoop those up. And of course, I know I said there's a bit of spare soul, but Cutlass unfortunately can't make amazing columns in this deck. Being a 5k, and the only real grade 2 being above a 9k is of course Blueblood, so that's 15k column, and I like to reuse my break ride, so odds are grade 3s don't always go on the rear guard circle, and when they do, they tend to get swapped out for another unit anyway that tends to have a guard value. So enough rambling, moving on to the null guards. Not much I can say about null guards. It makes sense to play 4. Granblue being a mid-game deck, after mid-game, can lack a little bit of pressure, so when you've got your break ride gambits off, or if you don't get them off before your opponent, these guys can be very helpful. Finally, one nice little tech, you probably see the peak of him there, John the Ghosty. Now, I figured this would be very interesting to play around with, because if you think about it like this, let's say you're break ridden, another Nightmist, or, let's see, yeah, either Kakaitis, or another Nightmist, doesn't matter which one either. You call this guy back, he's an 11k booster, odds are if your opponent's on free damage, they're going to let this column hit. So, this John the Ghosty that's now an 11k booster is going to return to your hand instead of being retired at the end of the turn. So it's an 11k pressure unit that you essentially get to keep, so you don't have to worry about swapping it out. Obviously late game this doesn't work very well, but yeah, it's a funny card generally. It's kind of an interesting card to tech. I had a free grade 1 spot. You could just as easily swap this out for another grade 2, maybe even another copy of Deadly Spirit, entirely up to you. Because Granblue is one of those decks, you generally want to play around with your ratios a little bit and really have fun with it. It's one of those decks you can be very creative with your deck building. So, 11k booster that returns to your hand, not too bad, eh? You get to keep all that guard value for next turn as well. So, moving on to grade 0s. There's currently 30 cards I've gone through so far, so as you can probably tell, I've had to dip into my grade 0 ratio for Chappies. Now, at the risk of not playing Ruined Shade, Chappies allow you to set up your drop zone without milling yourself out like crazy. So you don't need to do random mills anymore. You can do things like calculated mills with Chappies, which you always could do to start with. But getting those key units like Banshee, some of your grade 2 swappers like these guys, or even just a Corrosion Dragon or a Samurai Spirit if need be. Any of the cards we discussed earlier, generally you want to put in the drop zone. And you don't need to worry about your ride consistency as much. It's not the kind of deck where you need to plan your rides ahead, so it's a bit less technical in that sense. But yeah, Chappie, guard with it, 10k value, and send anything you want. And if you're about to mill out as well, because it does say up to 1, you can be very cheeky, and you can just check your deck. You don't have to send a card from your deck to the drop zone. You can basically look through it, see how many triggers you've got left, see what you've got left in your deck you can expect, and yeah, you can just generally plan ahead from there. It's a good card for that. So yeah, it has those advantages too. And of course, I'm going back to my standard sort of ratio that when I started playing Granblue is 4 of the Night Spirit, 4 of the Cannonball, and 4 of the Banshee. Now, I know a lot of people will say, don't spam your Banshees, and obviously don't spam your Banshees, so it's a pretty good card. But if you're ever at that point where you just need a little bit extra setup, having extra soul also couldn't hurt, because this essentially is a 1-for-1 card. Main resource in Granblue is deck, so deck thinning isn't amazing. It's not the kind of deck where you want to deck thin purposely. If you've got what you need in the setup, you've got your drop zone all ready to go, that's great, don't need to really worry about that. But yeah, only use the Banshees when you need them. That's all I need to say, and obviously 12 crits makes sense, because being a mid-game deck, you want to finish the game before it gets to late game, too far in late game anyway. You don't want to be going for 6-7 turns, because that's a little bit painful. And 12 crits can generally help finish off your opponent a little bit quicker, as I've probably said in other videos before. And of course, I'm sure it makes sense to have 4 heals. Heals keep you in the game longer. Not much I can say about that. Generally, not much I can say about that. And of course, the starter. Of course, Peter the Ghosty is an option, but after testing with it, I much prefer the classic Night Kid. If you think about it, this is the kind of deck you're going to be drawing pretty crazy. You can have like a huge hand. You can draw to the levels that, like Oracle Think Tank can draw to. So, negging yourself 1 for Captain Night Kid just to have a little bit of setup later to help you break even. Let's say you put a Banshee in there. That's going to help you break even later on. And instead of random milling with Peter, which gets 3 cards through your deck, you could randomly mill 2 triggers, which, not ideal. Really not ideal. So yeah, having Night Kid as a calculated drop, it's really handy. And not much I can say about that, actually. No, you don't always necessarily need to use him. Having extra soul, always good. And I don't know if I've just said this with Peter the Ghosty, I don't want to repeat myself too much. But Peter the Ghosty mills 2 and draws 1. So yes, he breaks even for a counterblast. But at the same time, he gets through 3 cards in your deck, whereas this gets through 1. So you've got less chance of milling out, and you have more calculated drops. So if you want to be a more calculated player, probably use Night Kid. And if you're new to Granblue, I definitely recommend going for Peter the Ghosty. It's not a bad card to play, and if you're not worried about milling out either, to be fair, this deck's very safe in the fact that it's probably not going to mill out too fast. So yeah, it's a good way to play Granblue. If you guys like the deck, of course, leave us a like in the section below. Don't know what that section's called. Anyway, subscribe if you want to see more, of course, and yeah, I'll see you next time.